Carlos had always been an adventurous traveler, preferring to stay in local homes rather than in personal hotels. His latest destination was an old city in Eastern Europe, rich with history and charm. He found an Airbnb listing for a beautiful apartment in the heart of the city, hosted by a woman named Katerina. The photos showed a cozy, well-decorated space with antique furniture and a view of the cobblestone streets below. From the moment Carlos arrived, something felt off. Katerina wasn't there to greet him. Instead, she left the key under a flower pot by the door. He let himself in and immediately noticed the heavy silence that filled the apartment. It was impeccably clean, almost too clean, as if no one had lived there in a long time. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. That first night, Carlos was restless. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The apartment creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, and shadows seemed to dance on the walls. At one point, he thought he heard whispers coming from the hallway, but when he investigated, he found nothing. The next morning, Carlos decided to explore the city. He tried to reach Katerina to ask for recommendations, but his messages went unanswered. He spent the day wandering through ancient streets and visiting historical landmarks, trying to push aside the unease that had settled in his chest. By the time he returned to the apartment, it was late, and the streets were eerily quiet. As he prepared for bed, he noticed a small door in the corner of the living room that he hadn't seen before. It was partially hidden behind a heavy curtain. Curiosity piqued. He tried the handle, but it was locked. He shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just a storage closet. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Carlos sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The voices seemed to be coming from behind the small door. Mustering his courage, he approached the door and pressed his ear against it. The whispers were clearer now, a mix of different languages, all pleading and crying. Carlos stepped back, shaken. He decided to leave the apartment the next day and find somewhere else to stay. He barely slept, and when morning came, he hurriedly packed his bags. As he reached for his phone to call a taxi, it buzzed with a new message. It was from Katerina. "Do not leave the apartment. It is not safe." Carlos froze, the message sending a chill down his spine. He tried to call her, but the call wouldn't connect. Panic set in as he realized his only option was to wait. He decided to investigate the small door once more. Using a hairpin, he managed to pick the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Against his better judgment, Carlos grabbed a flashlight and started down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. At the bottom, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a large wooden chest. Carlos hesitated before opening it. Inside, he found old, faded photographs of people, each one marked with dates spanning several decades. There were also journals, filled with accounts of people who had stayed in the apartment, all of whom had vanished without a trace. The last entry was from someone named Elena, dated just a week ago. The final line read, "He is watching. Do not trust him." A noise behind him made Carlos spin around. Standing in the doorway was a tall man with cold, dark eyes. Carlos recognized him from one of the photographs. It was the man who had disappeared 10 years ago. "Welcome," the man said with a chilling smile. "We've been waiting for you." Carlos tried to run, but the man moved impossibly fast, grabbing him by the arm and dragging him deeper into the shadows. The last thing Carlos heard before the darkness consumed him was the door above slamming shut, sealing his fate with the other lost souls of the apartment. Carlos struggled, but the man's grip was ironclad. As he was pulled further into the darkness, Carlos' mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare he had stumbled into. The air grew colder, and the whispers became an oppressive chorus, filling his ears and making it hard to think. Suddenly, they stopped in front of another door, this one made of heavy, reinforced metal. The man produced an old-fashioned key and unlocked it, pushing Carlos inside. The room was small and windowless, lit by a single flickering bulb. There were more photographs on the walls, along with newspaper clippings about missing tourists. In the corner, a camera on a tripod was pointed at a chair in the center of the room. The man shoved Carlos into the chair and began to bind his hands and feet with rough, fraying ropes. Carlos' protests were met with a cold, unfeeling stare. "You were never supposed to find out," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "But now that you have, you will join them." "Who are you?" Carlos managed to ask, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. He finished tying the knots and stepped back, admiring his handiwork. "I am the caretaker," he finally said. "I keep this place, and I ensure that those who enter never leave." Carlos's heart pounded. "Why? What do you want?" The caretaker smiled again, that same chilling smile. "It is not about what I want. It is about what they want." He gestured to the shadows around them. "This place hungers, and it must be fed." Before Carlos could respond, the caretaker left the room, closing the door behind him with a heavy thud. The sound of the lock turning was like the tolling of a death knell. Carlos was left alone in the dim light, surrounded by the evidence of countless victims who had come before him. Desperation clawed at his chest. He struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. His mind raced, searching for a way out. Then he remembered the journals he had seen earlier. Elena's last entry flashed in his mind. "He is watching. Do not trust him." Carlos scanned the room, looking for anything that might help. His eyes fell on a loose floorboard near the corner. It was a slim chance, but he had to try. He leaned forward, straining against the ropes, and managed to hook his foot under the edge of the board. With a surge of effort, he pried it loose, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a knife, old and slightly rusted, but sharp enough to cut through the ropes. Carlos worked quickly, sawing through the bindings until he was free. He stood up, his legs trembling from relief and fear. He knew he had to move fast. He crept to the door and listened. The caretaker's footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere above. Carlos took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness of the basement corridor. The whispers returned, but now they seemed to guide him, urging him to move faster. Carlos followed the faint light from his flashlight, retracing his steps. As he neared the stairs, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He climbed quickly, his heart pounding in his ears. At the top, he saw the small door he had entered through, now slightly ajar. He slipped through the door and found himself back in the living room of the apartment. The early morning light was beginning to filter through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Carlos didn't stop to catch his breath. He grabbed his bag and ran to the front door. Just as he reached for the handle, he heard the caretaker's voice behind him. "You can't escape, Carlos. You belong to this place now." Carlos didn't look back. He yanked the door open and fled into the street. The city was waking up, the normalcy of the morning a stark contrast to the horror he had just escaped. He ran until he reached a busy square, where he finally stopped, gasping for breath. He knew he had to get help, to tell someone about the nightmare hidden within that apartment. But as he turned to find a police station, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "You may have escaped, but you will never be free." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. He knew then that the terror of that place would haunt him forever, a dark shadow that would follow him wherever he went. Mason had always prided himself on his ability to find hidden gems on errand. An Aries by birth, his adventurous spirit drove him to seek unique experiences, and this time was no different. He booked a quaint, isolated cabin in the middle of the Oregon woods. The listing had only a few reviews, but they were all glowing. The photos showed a charming, rustic place surrounded by towering pine trees, far from any other human presence, perfect for a weekend of solitude and relaxation. He arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to set behind the dense forest. The cabin was even more picturesque in person, with a wooden porch, a stone chimney, and a cozy interior that smelled of pine and earth. Mason unpacked, lit a fire in the hearth, and settled in with a book. As the night fell, the silence of the woods enveloped him, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The first night was uneventful. Mason slept soundly, undisturbed by the usual city noises he was accustomed to. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. As he explored the property, he found a small, neglected shed hidden behind the cabin. Curiosity piqued. Mason forced the door open, revealing a clutter of old tools, rusty chains, and what appeared to be animal traps. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped inside, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. Brushing off his unease, Mason returned to the cabin. That night, he was awakened by a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere outside. He tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent. Finally, he got up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The tapping stopped. Mason swept the beam of light across the trees but saw nothing. Uneasy, he went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, he found a series of strange symbols etched into the wood of the porch. They hadn't been there the day before. His mind raced with possibilities. Pranksters, wildlife, something more sinister. The nearest town was miles away, and he hadn't seen another soul since he arrived. Mason's anxiety grew throughout the day. He tried to contact the errand post but got no response. When night fell, he fortified himself in the cabin, every door and window locked tight. But the tapping returned louder and closer. He could hear it moving around the cabin, as if something was circling the perimeter, looking for a way in. Desperate for answers, Mason scoured the cabin for any clues about its history. He found an old journal tucked away in a drawer, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to a previous guest. As Mason read, his blood ran cold. The entries spoke of the same noises, the same symbols, and culminated in a frantic, unfinished scrawl. They come at night. They want me to join them. I can't escape. The realization hit Mason like a punch to the gut. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was out there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Panic set in as he frantically packed his things, ready to leave this nightmare behind. But as he opened the front door, he was met with a sight that froze him in place. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a figure. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Mason could feel its eyes boring into him. In its hand, it held a carving knife, identical to the one he had found in the shed. Mason's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed away, the figure advancing with deliberate, menacing steps. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The figure raised the knife, and Mason knew he had only seconds to act. In a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and swung it at the intruder. The figure dodged, the knife slicing through the air and grazing Mason's arm. He cried out in pain, but didn't stop. He swung again, this time connecting with the figure's shoulder. The intruder stumbled, and Mason seized the opportunity to run. He dashed through the woods, branches scratching at his face and arms, the sounds of pursuit close behind. He could hear the figure crashing through the underbrush, relentless in its chase. Desperation drove Mason forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he burst onto a dirt road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Mason waved frantically, praying the driver would stop. The car slowed, and he threw himself at the door, screaming for help. The driver, a middle-aged man with a look of shock on his face, unlocked the doors and let Mason in. As they sped away, Mason looked back to see the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them disappear into the night. Mason never returned to the cabin. He reported the incident to the authorities, but they found no trace of the intruder or the strange symbols. The errand listing was taken down, and the cabin remained abandoned, a silent witness to the horrors that had transpired. But Mason knew the truth. He would never forget the tapping, the fear, and the cold, unrelenting eyes of the figure that had come for him in the night. Mason's life changed irrevocably after that night. He returned to the city, but he was never the same. His friends noticed his jumpiness, the dark circles under his eyes, and his newfound paranoia. He installed multiple locks on his apartment door and never left home after dark. He even moved to a higher floor, believing it would make him safer. Months passed, and Mason tried to move on. He went to therapy, attempting to process the trauma, but the memories haunted him, intruding into his thoughts and dreams. Every night, he replayed the chase, the terror, and the figure's relentless pursuit. One evening, as Mason was walking home from a late therapy session, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a shadow darting into an alley. His heart raced. Was it just his imagination? Had the paranoia finally taken over? He quickened his pace, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He reached his building, fumbling with his keys, feeling the presence behind him grow closer. Finally, he burst through the door and locked it behind him, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. That night, he dreamed of the cabin again. The tapping returned, louder and more insistent. In his dream, he saw the figure standing at the foot of his bed, the knife glinting in the moonlight. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, and decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to go back. He had to find out who or what was haunting him. The next morning, Mason packed a bag and drove back to the cabin. The drive was long and filled with dread, but he was determined to confront his fears. When he arrived, the cabin looked just as it had the last time he saw it, quiet, unassuming, and hiding its dark secrets. He entered cautiously, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air was thick with dust and decay, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. He moved from room to room, looking for anything he might have missed before. In the bedroom, he found the journal again. Flipping through the pages, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a loose page at the back. On it, written in shaky handwriting, was a map. It showed the cabin and a path leading deeper into the woods. Mason's heart pounded as he realized this might be the key to understanding what had happened. He followed the map, every step filling him with a sense of impending doom. The path led into a clearing where an old abandoned house stood. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar. Mason hesitated, but that a noise from inside compelled him to move forward. He entered the house, flashlight in hand, and the air turned colder, more oppressive. In the basement, he found what he feared most. The walls were covered in the same symbols that had been etched into the cabin's porch. There were photos of previous guests, all marked with dates and times. Mason's picture was there too, with the date of his last visit. A noise behind him made him spin around. There stood the figure, knife in hand, but this time its hood was down. Mason gasped. It was the errand host, the person who had lured him and countless others to this place. "You shouldn't have come back," the host said, their voice a chilling whisper. "We have a ritual to complete." Mason's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed a heavy object, a rusted pipe, and swung it at the host, knocking them down. He ran out of the house, heart pounding, and didn't stop until he reached his car. He sped away, vowing never to return. He reported everything to the police, providing them with the journal and the map. This time, they took him seriously. They raided the cabin and the house, finding evidence of the host's gruesome activities. The host was arrested, and the property was condemned. Mason tried to rebuild his life, but the scars of his ordeal remained. He moved to a new city, changed his name, and cut ties with his past. Yet every now and then, he would hear a soft, rhythmic tapping, and his heart would race with the fear that the nightmare was not yet over.